Over the centuries and throughout history, there have been many women who ruled over their nations and countries with skill. Queens such as Elizabeth I managed to see off the biggest threats to her nation, and she would even deal with those who rebelled with brutality. Elizabeth's half-sister, Mary I, is remembered for a different reason. She is known most commonly as Bloody Mary, for the fact that she burnt hundreds of people at the stake for their religious beliefs and views. But in the years since, many notorious queens have had their coffins and graves opened, and their remains have been analysed and looked at. In this video, we look at some of the most infamous queens in history, and we consider what state their corpses and remains will be in today. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. By the early 1600s, Elizabeth was an old woman by the standards of her time. She had been born in 1533 and was approaching her 70th year, an extraordinary age in the 16th century. For decades she had lived under the constant pressures of rule, political intrigues, religious struggles, and the burdens of never marrying or producing an heir. Her health had slowly begun to fail, and those close to her noticed that she was increasingly weary. Elizabeth's last years were also marked by grief. Many of the people who had surrounded her for most of her reign, trusted courtiers, friends, and advisers, were dying off one by one. Most painfully was the death of Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, in 1601. Essex had been a favourite of the Queen. Some said even a love interest, but after he led a failed rebellion, Elizabeth had no choice but to sign his death warrant. Watching him go to the executioner weighed heavily on her conscience. Those close to her remarked that she never fully recovered from that decision. By the winter of 1602 to 1603, Elizabeth's health was visibly deteriorating. She complained of aches and pains, and her appetite grew weaker. She had always taken great pride in her appearance, covering herself with elaborate gowns, jewellery, and the iconic white makeup that gave her face its ghostly glow. But now she could no longer disguise her frailty. Observers described her as thin and melancholy. Her teeth, once famously crooked, had decayed further, making speech more difficult. She became prone to long silences, staring off into the distance as if lost in thought. Her court physicians could do little. Medical knowledge at the time was limited, and treatments often involved bleeding or strange potions. None of this eased her decline. What seemed to have pushed Elizabeth more deeply into her final decline was sorrow. In the spring of 1603, another of her close companions, Lady Catherine Howard, died. This loss struck the Queen hard. She sank into depression, refusing to eat or sleep properly. She spent long hours sitting on the floor, refusing to go to bed. Eyewitnesses recorded that she sat motionless for hours, sometimes with her fingers pressed to her lips, her eyes staring into the shadows. Courtiers begged her to lie down, but she resisted, saying that if she lay down she would never rise again. It was as if Elizabeth, who had always been strong-willed, was preparing herself for the end. By March of 1603, Elizabeth had stopped eating almost entirely. She was growing weaker, but her mind remained sharp. She was aware of her condition and knew that death was close. She reportedly told her ladies-in-waiting, "I am not sick, I feel no pain, yet I know I shall not live." Her refusal to sleep in bed became a strange ritual in her final days. She would sit on cushions on the floor, her back supported by pillows, and there she remained. Courtiers tried to persuade her to take to her bed, but she insisted the floor was where she would stay. On March 23rd, after days of watching her slowly waste away, her counsellors grew alarmed. They pressed her into a name of a successor, and Elizabeth had always avoided this issue during her reign, fearing that naming an heir would make her vulnerable. But now, at the edge of death, she could no longer avoid the question. The future of England depended on who would inherit the throne. Without an heir, civil war might erupt. Elizabeth's most likely successor was James VI of Scotland, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary had been Elizabeth's cousin and rival, whom Elizabeth had reluctantly executed in 1587. Now, years later, her son was poised to inherit the English throne and unite the crowns of England and Scotland. When asked who would succeed her, Elizabeth could no longer speak clearly, but she made a gesture with her hand, forming a circle to indicate the letter O, which her counsellors interpreted as a sign for James of Scotland. Some accounts say she whispered the words, and others that she nodded in agreement. Either way, the message was clear. James would be king. By the evening of March 23rd, Elizabeth was gravely ill. Her body was weak, and she slipped in and out of consciousness. Courtiers kept vigil around her, whispering prayers and hoping for a peaceful passing. And on March 24, 1603, Elizabeth I died at Richmond Palace. She was 69 years old. The exact cause of her death is uncertain. Some historians believe she succumbed to pneumonia or blood poisoning from the white lead makeup she had used for decades. Others simply suggest that exhaustion of old age. What is certain is that she met her end quietly, without the dramatic scenes of some monarchs who witnessed her passing remarked on her dignity even in death. Now, Elizabeth I had stipulated following her death she did not want to be embalmed in the method and tradition which was done for centuries. Normally, during the embalming process, the vital organs, such as the heart and other body parts, were removed, and this was done to preserve the body in a better way, so it could remain fresher for centuries. This has proven to have been successful, as some medieval English kings have had their coffins opened even 500 years after their deaths, and their skin and bodies have remained remarkably preserved, and even human-like. Some eyes inside of the sockets have still remained, as the body was also protected in a thick wax-coated shroud known as cerecloth. Elizabeth I had made it known to her doctors she did not want this. She did not want her body to be cut open, and she wanted to be buried whole, without any parts removed. Now, against her wishes, within hours of her death, the physicians inside of Richmond Palace got to work. They washed the Queen's corpse, and they then began to remove her vital organs. The body parts removed were her heart, her viscera, as in her intestines, her lungs, and other parts. The cuts made into her body were large, and inside of the cavity created as the organs were removed, the physicians washed and placed a number of materials inside to dry out her corpse. They would also have placed spices and fragrant-smelling materials into this cavity too. Her heart, after it was removed, was actually placed inside of a lead-lined box, and this was to be buried elsewhere. But throughout the centuries it has been found that it didn't go far, as it was actually buried in the same burial vault as Elizabeth's coffin. The point of this was to preserve her body for centuries after, but let's remember she did not want this to happen. But it was probably a good reason that it happened, and that her body was embalmed, and body parts were removed. It was probably Robert Cecil, Elizabeth's Secretary of State, who told the doctors to go ahead with the embalming, and he probably did not know what Elizabeth had said. After the body was prepared, it was placed inside of a coffin, a large wooden one that Elizabeth had constructed for her decades before. This coffin carried a Tudor rose and her name. She was left to lie in state inside of her privy chamber and was attended on by her maids of honour and ladies who held vigil around her body. The coffin was lead-lined to further protect the remains, and after lying in state for several days, the coffin lid was placed on the base, and then the procession to the funeral began. Earlier, I said that it was possibly a good thing that the Queen's wishes were ignored, and that is because upon the transport of her coffin to Westminster Abbey, something went very wrong. From inside of the coffin, attendants who remained close to it heard a very loud crack or a bang, which emanated from within the wooden box. What had happened is that there had been a build-up of gas inside of Elizabeth's corpse, and when the coffin processed on the cobbled streets of London, this gas then escaped from the body, and there was an explosion from within. The force of the explosion was so great it was said the body and head of the Queen broke open from the pressure, and people speculated that it would have been much worse if the body had not been opened and disemboweled after death. The force of the explosion was so great that it allegedly damaged the wood and lead of the coffin, and also the cerecloth she had been wrapped in. There may have even been some urgent repair work done to the coffin, but this is not known. When her coffin was buried to begin with, it was placed inside the royal vault of her grandfather and grandmother, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. It would later be moved to her own vault, which today is marked by a huge and grand lifelike tomb and effigy of the final Tudor Queen. This vault was later opened, and in the 19th century it was found the wood at the head of the coffin of Elizabeth had fallen in, and some of the sides were crumbling and had fallen away because of the decay. This would suggest there was an explosion and damage caused, and her coffin was actually placed directly above Mary I's, her half-sister, to symbolise her greatness over Mary, even in death. The death of Elizabeth I in March of 1603 was not sudden or violent, but it was slow and sorrowful. Surrounded by grief and weakened by age, she faced the end with quiet dignity. Her final act, acknowledging James as her heir, ensured that her death did not plunge the nation into chaos. Elizabeth's last days remind us that even the greatest rulers are mortal. After nearly 70 years of life and more than 4 decades of rule, she left behind a legacy that shaped England's identity for centuries. Her death closed the Tudor chapter of English history and opened the Stuart one, but her memory has never faded. Mary Stuart was born in December of 1542 at Linlithgow Palace in Scotland. She was just 6 days old when her father, King James V of Scotland, died, and she became queen. Because she was an infant, Scotland was ruled by regents on her behalf, and from birth Mary's life was entangled with politics and danger. She was both Queen of Scots and a possible heir to the English throne through her grandmother, Margaret Tudor, the sister of King Henry VIII. In 1548, to protect her from English invasions, she went to France. She grew up at the French court and was married at 16 to the young Dauphin Francis, who became King Francis II of France. And for a short time, Mary was both Queen of France and Queen of Scotland. But when Francis died suddenly in 1560, the young widow, still only 18, returned to rule Scotland. Mary came home to a country that had changed. The Scottish Reformation had taken hold. The Protestant nobles, inspired by John Knox, were suspicious of their Catholic queen, though she promised tolerance and religious conflict constantly undermined her rule. In 1565, she married her cousin, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. At first, the match seemed ideal. Both were of royal blood and Catholics, but Darnley's arrogance and ambition soon created problems. He was jealous of Mary's friendship with her Italian secretary, David Rizzio, and in March of 1566, a group of nobles, including Darnley, burst into Mary's private chamber and murdered Rizzio in front of her. Mary was 6 months pregnant at the time, and despite this horror, she later gave birth to her only child, James, in the June of 1566, who would one day unite the crowns of Scotland and England. Mary's troubles deepened when Darnley was found dead in February of 1567. His house, near Edinburgh, Kirkhoe Field, had been destroyed by an explosion, but his body was found outside, apparently strangled. Suspicion immediately fell on the Earl of Bothwell, a powerful nobleman who many believed had orchestrated Darnley's murder. To the shock of Europe, Mary married Bothwell just 3 months later. Whether she was forced into it or acted willingly remained debated, but it destroyed her reputation. Many nobles rose in rebellion, accusing her of complicity in Darnley's death. She was captured at Carberry Hill and imprisoned at Lochleven Castle, where she was forced to abdicate in favour of her infant son, James VI. Mary escaped the following year, raised an army, but was defeated at the Battle of Langside. With no choice left, she fled south into England, seeking refuge from her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I. Mary believed Elizabeth would help her regain her throne. Instead, Elizabeth saw her as a threat. Many Catholics regarded Mary as the rightful Queen of England, arguing that Elizabeth's claim was illegitimate because Henry VIII's marriage to Anne Boleyn had been invalid in the eyes of Rome. Elizabeth, cautious and politically shrewd, kept Mary under house arrest, and for nearly 2 decades she was moved from one castle to another: Bolton, Tutbury, Sheffield, and finally Fotheringhay. She was treated more as a royal guest than a common prisoner, but she was closely watched. Letters were intercepted, visitors monitored, and her every move reported to Elizabeth's advisers, including the formidable Sir Francis Walsingham. After years passed, plots and conspiracies in Mary's name grew. The Catholic world saw her as a symbol of hope against Protestant England. To Elizabeth and her government, she became a living danger. In 1586, everything changed. A young Catholic nobleman named Anthony Babington conspired to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne. The plan involved foreign support and a secret correspondence with Mary herself. Unknown to her, Walsingham's agents had intercepted and deciphered the letters. In one of them, Mary appeared to approve the plot, writing that she would countenance and command the enterprise. This was the evidence Elizabeth's government needed. Mary was charged with treason, though she argued she could not be guilty since she was not an English subject. Nevertheless, in October of 1586 she was tried at Fotheringhay Castle before 36 commissioners. The verdict was inevitably guilty of conspiring to kill the Queen of England. Even with the evidence, Elizabeth hesitated. Executing a fellow monarch was almost unthinkable. It set a dangerous precedent. Elizabeth feared that killing Mary might provoke war with Catholic Europe, or even rebellion at home. For weeks she delayed signing the death warrant, but her counsellors, especially Walsingham and Lord Burleigh, pressed her to act. In early February of 1587, Elizabeth finally signed the warrant, perhaps intending to be delayed further, but her council set it to Fotheringhay immediately. When Elizabeth learned that Mary was dead, she claimed she had not authorised the execution and punished her secretary, William Davison, for sending the order. Whether this was genuine shock or political theatre remains debated. On the morning of 8th of February 1587, Mary dressed carefully for her last appearance. She wore a gown of black velvet over a crimson petticoat, the red symbolising martyrdom in Catholic tradition, and she spent her final hours praying with her servants and writing farewell letters, including one to the King of France. At around 8 a.m. she was led into the great hall of Fotheringhay Castle. Around 300 people had gathered to witness the execution, including officials, soldiers and local notables. A wooden scaffold draped in black cloth had been erected. Mary faced her death with remarkable composure. She declared that she was a Catholic and ready to die for religion. She prayed for Elizabeth's welfare and forgave her executioners. Her attendants wept as they helped her remove her black outer garments, revealing the crimson dress beneath. She knelt, placed her head on the block, and repeated, Immaneus Taus Domin commendo spiritum meum. Into your hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit. The first blow struck her on the neck, but failed to sever the head completely. The second finished the grim task. When the executioner lifted the head by the hair to show the crowd, Mary's auburn wig came away in his hand, and her hair beneath was short and grey. A small dog, her Skye Terrier, was found hiding beneath her skirts, covered in her blood. Now, immediately after her death, anything that could have been touched by her blood was burnt in the Great Hall's fire to prevent relics being taken care of. This included even the executioner's block and the scaffold. But Mary's body was taken away and was then placed inside of the presence chamber within Fotheringhay Castle, a room probably upstairs in the keep that sat on the hill. Now it was simply left there, and there have been rumours that in the window of the chamber that her head was just left to act as a warning, and that anyone who went to the castle was greeted by the severed head of Mary. This could have occurred as traitors, a crime Mary was sentenced to death for at this point had put their heads placed on public display. But it's more likely that following her execution, royal embalmers attended to her corpse and then sewed her head back onto her corpse. This was done to royals who were executed, and happened to her later relative King Charles I, who lost his head following the English Civil War. Mary's corpse was then embalmed. With this, her heart, entrails, lungs, liver and intestines were all removed from her body, through an incision and cut in her chest. These were then placed inside of a box, a lead-lined casket which was allegedly buried inside the walls of Fotheringhay Castle. This has never been found, and the heart may still exist somewhere. It was known it was buried close to the Great Hall. Now after this, Mary's body was washed in rose water, and perfumes in the cavity created from the organ removal was then washed and filled with various items such as spices and perfumes to preserve it. After all, she was still a queen and a royal, so a great amount of expense would have been allowed for this. Then the coffin was sealed up and was left for months. Elizabeth I was conflicted by her decision to execute Mary, and after the event she became disillusioned with those who had advised her to do this, and she was angry that she had been convinced to do this. Because of this, Mary's coffin was left inside of Fotheringhay, just gathering dust. It's presumed her body was wrapped inside of a cerecloth and a heavy wax-coated shroud, which added some protection. Eventually, the decision was made to inter Mary, and her body was taken to Peterborough Cathedral, the closest major church to Fotheringhay, and she was interred there inside of a grave. There was a huge amount of pomp and ceremony at this funeral, and the grave was found next to the high altar and opposite the tomb of Catherine of Aragon, but this was not her final resting place. When Elizabeth I died, her successor James I, Mary's son, took the English throne, and he ordered his mother's remains exhumed, and they were placed inside of a burial vault within Westminster Abbey. Despite being well and carefully exhumed, it was noted at the time the coffin of Mary was not in a good way when it reached Westminster. It was placed inside of a new vault in the Henry VII Lady Chapel, and above the vault is a huge lifelike effigy of her and her tomb. Now, in the years following, the vault had been opened, and it had been said that Mary is buried with dozens of her relatives inside of the Stuart vault, and her vault has become a magnet for those who have Stuart blood. Her coffin was left damaged near to the wall, and was said to have been split open at some point, which means that her remains and corpse would be subjected to a significant amount of decay and decomposition. This could have reduced her corpse to nothing more than skeletal remains. Also, the injuries she sustained could have caused further rotting and decay, but still today, Mary Queen of Scots is buried within Westminster Abbey, across from the mortal remains of the woman who sent her to the executioner's block, Elizabeth I. Marie Antoinette was born in Vienna, Austria, on November 2nd, 1755, the 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa and Emperor Francis I. Her early life was one of privilege and luxury. At just 14 years old, she was married off to Louis Auguste, the shy and awkward grandson of King Louis XV of France. The marriage was meant to strengthen the alliance between Austria and France, two nations that had long been enemies, and when she arrived in France, the young Austrian princess struggled to adapt. She didn't speak much French, and she found the strict etiquette of the royal court at Versailles suffocating. But when her husband became King Louis XVI in 1774, Marie Antoinette, then only 19, suddenly found herself queen of one of the most powerful kingdoms in the world. At Versailles, Marie Antoinette tried to escape the pressures of royal life by surrounding herself with a small circle of friends. She built a private retreat, the Petit Trianon, and spent her days there playing music, dressing in the latest fashions, and hosting lavish parties. Her expensive tastes and carefree attitude quickly became infamous. The people of France, meanwhile, were struggling. Food prices were rising, the country was in a massive debt, and millions of ordinary citizens were hungry. While they starved, the Queen was portrayed in pamphlets as heartless and wasteful. Some even called her Madame Deficit. One of the most damaging rumours was that, when told that the poor had no bread, Marie Antoinette supposedly said, "Let them eat cake." In truth, there's no evidence that she ever said this. It first appeared in writings years before her time, but the story captured what many already believed, that she was out of touch with the suffering of her people. By 1789, anger and resentment had reached a boiling point. The French Revolution began, and mobs filled the streets of Paris. In October of 1789, a crowd of women marched from Paris to Versailles demanding bread. They stormed the palace and forced the royal family to move to the Tuileries Palace in Paris, effectively holding them under guard. Marie Antoinette became a target of revolutionary hatred. Her Austrian birth made her suspect, and people accused her of conspiring with foreign powers to destroy the revolution. When she and Louis tried to flee Paris in 1791, their capture at Varnez only confirmed suspicion that they were traitors to the new France. After their failed attempt, the royal couple lived as prisoners in the Tuileries, watched constantly by guards, and in August of 1792, the monarchy was finally abolished after angry crowds, attacked the palace. The royal family was imprisoned in the Temple Tower, and France was declared a republic. King Louis XVI was tried by the National Convention, found guilty of treason, and executed by guillotine on January 21st, 1793. His death left Marie Antoinette alone, widowed and powerless. Her son, the young Louis Charles, was declared Louis XVII by royalists, but the revolutionaries soon separated him from his mother and placed him under brutal supervision. Marie Antoinette was then moved to the Conciergerie, a grim prison on the Ile de Sight, often called the antechamber to the guillotine. She lived there in a small, damp cell and under heavy guard. Her health deteriorated from stress and illness, and despite everything, witnesses said she carried herself with dignity, rarely showing emotion, even as her fate became clear. In October of 1793, the Revolutionary Tribunal announced that Marie Antoinette would be put on trial. She was accused of treason, draining the treasury, plotting against the revolution, and most shockingly, incest with her son, a charge based on false testimony extracted from the frightened boy. The trial began on October 14th, and the outcome was never in doubt. The prosecution painted her as the enemy of the French people, responsible for their misery and the bloodshed of the revolution. When asked about the accusation of incest, Marie Antoinette reportedly stood and said, "Nature refuses to answer such a charge made against a mother." Even the hostile crowd fell briefly silent. After 2 days of questioning, the tribunal found her guilty of treason. Her sentence was death by guillotine. At dawn, on October 16, 1793, Marie Antoinette was woken by guards and told to prepare for her execution. She dressed in a simple white gown, symbolic of purity, and tied her hair back so it would not interfere with the blade. Unlike her husband, who had to be driven to the scaffold in a carriage, she was placed in an open cart, exposed to the jeering crowd. The journey from the Conciergerie to the Place de la Révolution, today's Place de la Concorde, took nearly an hour. Witnesses said she sat upright, calm and composed, though pale. Onlookers shouted insults, but some were struck by her courage. When she arrived, she was led up the steps to the guillotine by the executioner, Charles Henry Sanson. As she climbed, she accidentally stepped on his foot and turned to him, saying her final words, "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose." Moments later, the blade fell. It was 12:15 p.m. The crowd cheered wildly, waving their hats and shouting, "Viva la République!" Her head was shown to the people, proof the Queen of France was no more. Immediately after her execution, her remains were collected up by the officials and the executioner, and they were placed on the back of a cart ready for burial. It's presumed that they were placed inside of a coffin immediately after death, but her head was not sewn back on. It was stuck in between the legs of the Queen in the coffin, meaning a symbolism of disgrace in death and dishonour. It was no way to treat the body of a queen or any member of royalty. After this, the coffin was taken to the Madeleine Cemetery, a place nearby where many victims of Paris's guillotine were taken. There, gravediggers were preparing the grave, and they were ordered to dig a shallow grave. They presumed it was the body of an everyday, defiant French person they were about to inter. They probably did not realise it was the remains of the Queen. After the coffin arrived, the body was dumped inside of the grave, and then copious amounts of quicklime were poured over it. The coffin lid was closed, and the quicklime covered the coffin lid and did not act as intended, as it actually solidified, which led to the remains being preserved further. Now, the grave was covered over, and for decades it was no secret where the Queen was buried. After the brief restoration of the monarchy, a call was made to exhume Marie's body and that of her husband. The exhumation began on the 18th of January 1815, and former gravediggers took part. The Queen's remains were found first, and it was said that a number of bones were found, including the skull, which was said to have been relatively intact. As the quicklime had solidified on the coffin lid, there was a degree of protection to the body. Also found was a woman's stocking, similar to the one given to her inside of prison to wear. And on her head were found some hair, the grey hair that she had become accustomed to in the final months of her life. It was a moving sight, and some even fainted or burst into tears. Now, these bodily remains were then placed inside of a chest, along with parts of the earth, and the wooden coffin fragments which were found. Some of the bones were actually missing, and the position of the skull being found between the legs also confirmed she had lost her head upon a guillotine through being severed from the body. One man who found the Queen's corpse said, "In this coffin we found a number of bones, but several were wanting, having undoubtedly been reduced to dust. The skull was entire, and its position indicated incontestably that it had been severed from the body. We also found remains of clothing, and particularly 2 elastic garters, in good preservation. The whole were placed into a chest and locked up. In another chest were deposited the earth and lime found mixed with the bones. The bones were then taken to the Basilia of St. Denis, where they were then interred inside of a royal vault, and today Marie Antoinette is still buried inside of this vault. But the truth is, the fragmentary remains of her body are. She is in no way a complete skeleton, and only her skull and a few other parts of her bones were interred in this vault. There is also some speculation as to whether this was even the Queen at all, as DNA evidence has never confirmed this. The body of Queen Marie Antoinette was treated with shame and disdain after the execution, and many believed she was the worst criminal in the whole of France. Many jeered when the guillotine came down, and one image even shows her head being displayed on a pike, a large wooden pole, so that everybody could see. Her image on the guillotine is a haunting one, and her body was treated awfully, but some of her remains are given somewhat of a royal burial. Catherine was born in 1401 in Paris, the daughter of King Charles VI of France, known as Charles the Mad, because of his reoccurring bouts of insanity, and Queen Isabeau of Bavaria. Her childhood was shaped by war and chaos. France was torn apart by civil conflict between rival factions, and the 100 Years' War with England raged on. In 1420, as part of the Treaty of Troyes, Catherine was married to the English King Henry V, following his great victory at Agincourt. The treaty disinherited her own brother, the Dauphin of France, and made Henry V the heir to the French throne. Their marriage was both political and symbolic, meant to unite England and France under one ruler. In 1421, Catherine gave birth to their only son, Henry VI, at Windsor Castle, but tragedy struck soon after, and in 1422, just a year later, Henry V died suddenly of dysentery at the age of 35, whilst campaigning in France. Catherine was only 21 years old, a widow, and the mother of a 9-month-old baby who was now king of both England and France. As the young Queen Dowager, Catherine was expected to live quietly and with dignity, but her situation was a lonely one. Henry V's death left her in an uncertain position at the English court. Her infant son, Henry VI, was too young to rule, and real power lay with a council of noblemen. The English nobility were suspicious of Catherine because she was French. They feared that if she remarried, her new husband might gain political influence over the young king. So, to prevent this, Parliament passed a law in 1427 that restricted her freedom to marry. This law stated Catherine could not marry without the king's consent, and since the king was a child, that effectively meant she could not remarry at all for many years. It was a harsh rule that condemned her to live alone, despite only being in her 20s. Now, despite the restrictions, Catherine did fall in love again, and with someone far below her royal rank. His name was Owen Tudor, a Welsh squire who may have served as a servant or keeper of her household at Windsor or in London. No one knows exactly how their relationship began, but it was likely a love match rather than a political one. Owen was a handsome man from a noble Welsh family, and Catherine was a lonely widow craving companionship. Their affair was kept a secret for years, but by the late 1420s or early 1430s, the truth began to emerge. Catherine had borne several children by Owen, and their marriage, if it took place at all, was never officially recorded, perhaps because it would have broken the parliamentary law that forbade her to marry without permission. Nevertheless, their relationship was genuine. They had at least 3 sons, Edmund, Jasper, and possibly Owen, and one daughter who became a nun. By the late 1430s, Catherine's health began to fail. It's believed she suffered from some form of long illness, perhaps linked to childbirth complications or infections that were common at the time. And in January of 1437, Catherine travelled to Westminster Abbey, possibly to take the veil as a nun, a common act of piety for royal widows who knew they were dying. But she never recovered, and on the 3rd of January 1437, Catherine of Valois died at the age of 35. The cause of her death was never officially recorded, but historians believe it may have been due to complications after childbirth. Some sources suggest she had given birth to another child by Owen Tudor, not long before her death, and that the child also died young. Her death was quiet and without ceremony, far removed from the grandeur of her earlier life as Queen of England and the daughter of a French king. Catherine was buried in Westminster Abbey, the traditional resting place of English monarchs and their families. Her body was laid in the original Lady Chapel, near the shrine of St. Edward the Confessor. This would not be her burial place for very long. When her grandson, Henry VII, came onto the throne, he created a new Lady Chapel, and with this Catherine's body was exhumed and removed due to the expansion. But it was never reburied. The following Tudors, who all descended from her, didn't inter her remains either, and with this her body was left inside of a coffin. Now, the coffin at times would be opened for people who paid a small fee to see her remains, and it would reveal her corpse, and for some time it became a tourist attraction. Her corpse had been embalmed, and with this her vital organs, such as her heart, lungs, and liver, had been removed, cut out from her body along with her entrails, and this was done to preserve the remains. But then the corpse was buried naked for some reason, but was wrapped inside of a cerecloth, a heavy wax-dipped cloth, aimed to preserve her body. And it's known that this cloth did a good job, as when the Queen's coffin was opened, witnesses described seeing her face in the earlier centuries, and said that she looked relatively lifelike. The coffin eventually was just left open, and people passed by her remains and body. Thieves even may have stolen parts of her body, such as her toes and fingers, and as the body decomposed quicker, she was reduced to skeletal rotting remains, with some flesh on the bones. On the 23rd of February 1669, famous London writer Samuel Pepys attended Westminster Abbey and even kissed the decaying corpse of Queen Catherine. He wrote, "There did show them all the tombs very finely, having one with us alone, there being another, company this day to see the tombs, it being Shrove Tuesday, and here we did see, by particularly a favour, the body of Queen Catherine of Valois, and I had the upper part of her body in my hands, and I did kiss her mouth, reflecting upon it that I did kiss a queen, and that this was my birthday, 36 years old, that I did first kiss a queen." Now, over the next century, the body was allegedly even mauled and desecrated, being pulled into pieces by Westminster schoolboys who took parts of it. But then the corpse was laid to rest inside of a new vault. But during the reign of Queen Victoria, the decision was made to examine what actually was left of Catherine. The coffin was opened, and it was found the mortal remains of the Queen were nothing more than an incomplete mess of bones which had been rearranged in a strange way, and eventually Victoria had Catherine of Valois deposited in her own tomb, and today this is difficult to find inside of the abbey. The corpse and royal remains of Catherine of Valois were subjected to a shocking and harrowing ordeal inside of the aftermath of her death, and in the centuries after. People paid to see and even hold her corpse and body, and it was nothing short of disgusting. Mary Tudor was the daughter of King Henry VIII and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Born in 1516, she was a princess of promise. Her father adored her as a child, and she was highly educated, fluent in Latin, French and Spanish. But when Henry broke with Rome to marry Anne Boleyn, Mary's world collapsed. Declared illegitimate and separated from her mother, she lived in humiliation and fear. These early experiences left her deeply scarred and profoundly religious. Her Catholic faith became the anchor of her life, and when she finally became queen in 1553, she was determined to undo her father's Protestant Reformation. She reinstated papal authority, restored the Mass, and burned hundreds of Protestant heretics at the stake. These executions earned her the title Bloody Mary. But to her, they were acts of spiritual duty, purging England of heresy to save souls. By 1558, Mary's health had been failing for years. The first signs appeared not long after her marriage to Philip of Spain in 1554. The union, meant to strengthen England's Catholic ties, was unpopular. Many English people feared Spanish domination, and Mary's subjects soon turned against her once it became clear that Philip cared little for her or her kingdom. Her greatest personal heartbreak came in 1555, when she believed herself to be pregnant. Her belly swelled, her breasts enlarged, and she prepared a nursery at Hampton Court. Court physicians and attendants were convinced she was with child, but months passed with no birth. Eventually, her supposed pregnancy ended in humiliation. What she had experienced was likely a false pregnancy, perhaps caused by a combination of stress, hormonal imbalance, or even uterine disease. The phantom pregnancy devastated her. She felt cursed, abandoned by her husband, mocked by her enemies, and betrayed by her own body. Philip returned to Spain soon after, leaving Mary isolated and grief-stricken. In 1557, she believed she was pregnant again, but once more no child came. Historians have long debated her symptoms. Some suggest she suffered from uterine cancer, ovarian cysts, or a tumour that mimicked pregnancy. Others think her condition was psychosomatic, a desperate longing for motherhood made real by her own mind and body. Mary's health worsened rapidly in the summer of 1558. She was often feverish, weak, and plagued by severe abdominal pain. She struggled to walk and relied increasingly on her ladies-in-waiting. Reports from the Spanish ambassador, Count de Fiera, described her as emaciated, melancholy, and resigned to death. She suffered swelling in her legs, a constant thirst, and a persistent cough, symptoms that might indicate dropsy, edema, or kidney disease. Her eyesight grew dim, and she could no longer read comfortably. Still, she clung to her religious routines, hearing Mass daily and praying for the restoration of Catholicism in England. Meanwhile, her country was collapsing around her. The war with France had led to the catastrophic loss of Calais in January of 1558, England's last possession of the continent. The defeat cut Mary to heart. "When am I dead and opened?" she reportedly said. "You shall find Calais lying in my heart." Her husband Philip, who had briefly returned to England in 1557 to drag her into that very war, was again in Spain and offered no comfort. She received no letters from him in her final months. Alone in her palace at St. James's Palace, she withdrew from court life, attended only by her small circle of loyal servants. In October of 1558, Mary took to her bed. Too weak to move without help, she was attended by her half-sister Elizabeth's former governess, Catherine Ashley, and her faithful servants, Jane Dormer and Susan Clarencio. The atmosphere in the palace was heavy with candlelight and the sound of prayers. Those around her knew the end was near. The imperial ambassador wrote that she had given up hope of life. Mary herself seemed to accept her fate calmly. She confessed to her priests, received the last rites, and prepared her soul for death. Despite her suffering, she spoke often of forgiveness and of her wish that her people remain true to the Catholic faith. One of her final acts was to name her successor. Though she had long despised Elizabeth, viewing her as a heretic and the product of her father's sin, Mary accepted the inevitable. On the 6th of November 1558, she acknowledged Elizabeth as heir, reportedly saying that she hoped her sister would uphold the true religion. A week later, the Queen lay dying. She murmured prayers in Latin, and witnesses said she clutched a crucifix tight to her chest. As dawn broke on the 17th of November 1558, Mary I passed away peacefully. She was 42 years old. The news spread quickly through London. Bells rang, not for joy, at least not officially. Yet many people did rejoice privately. For Protestants, Mary's death was deliverance from tyranny. For Catholics, it was tragedy. In Westminster Abbey, priests wept at the loss of the first Queen Regnant of England. Philip II of Spain, when told of her death, is said to have remarked coldly, "I feel a reasonable regret," and within hours of her passing, Elizabeth was proclaimed queen to cheers across London. But following her death, Mary I's body was embalmed. With this, she was embalmed in the manner traditional for royals at the time, and her body was washed first, and then a large cut was made in her stomach and chest. This was done so the physicians could remove her heart and other internal organs, and they were then placed in a chest to be buried separately from her body. This was done as an attempt to try and keep her corpse as fresh as possible. The cavity was then filled with spices and other items, and her body was washed once more with perfumes, and she was then laid inside of her lead-lined coffin. This was a wooden coffin, but inside of a lead linen was placed in order to preserve her remains in a better way. Her body had also been wrapped in a cerecloth, a large and heavy thick wax-dipped cloth which acted as a shroud, and it was meant to protect the remains further. Cerecloths have been able to preserve royal remains very well, even for many centuries, so there is a possibility that inside of her coffin, Mary I's remains today are well preserved and have not been reduced to a skeleton. The funeral of Mary I was conducted inside of Westminster Abbey. She had a Catholic funeral and a large processional occurred. An effigy of her was placed on top of the coffin, and this was dressed in crimson velvet robes of state, and had a crown, orb, and spectre, and also the fingers were adorned with rings. But inside of the abbey, Mary I was buried on the north side of the Henry VII Lady Chapel, in a rather significant and large vault. Now for decades she lay there in her own coffin and vault undisturbed. But following the death of Elizabeth I and during the reign of King James I, Elizabeth I's coffin was moved to the vault. Elizabeth and Mary were half-sisters, but in one final burn to Mary I, King James ordered that Elizabeth's coffin should be placed directly above Mary's inside of the vault. This means they stacked on top of the coffin of Mary, her half-sister, to symbolise that even in death, Elizabeth was a better and more significant monarch. Today, with the burial chamber, there is little to suggest Mary's body lies there. Expect a small plaque which marks the site, saying that their two are sisters in death. There is little reference to Mary. And in opposition to this, there is a huge marble tomb showing Elizabeth I. However, in the 19th century, the burial vault of Mary I was opened. When this was opened, inside it was confirmed the two coffins were placed one on top of the other. It was said there was no disorder or decay except the wood at the head of the coffin on the top had fallen in and some of the sides were crumbling. With this, we have to consider that Mary I's coffin was rather well preserved then compared to Elizabeth, and this means that possibly today her remains inside of the coffin are well preserved, meaning her royal corpse could be intact. The coffin has never been opened, and this has never been peered into to confirm this, but it is very much possible. The cerecloth and embalming has done its job. We must also think that Mary's first resting place was her final resting place, unlike that of Elizabeth I's remains, which were moved from another vault in the abbey. Thank you for watching, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. And once again, thank you so much for watching.